I first spotted the solid oak table sitting in the window of this dusty antique shop on the walk home from a soul-crushing marketing interview. I was fresh out of college, broke and drowning in student loans, spending my days hunting for full-time work while barely scraping by on flaky freelance design gigs and a shitty part-time temp job. But when I saw that table, I was obsessed. It felt like the one adult thing I needed to finally make my tiny, empty apartment feel like home. It took 4 months of side hustles, skipping meals for ramen, and keeping my thermostat at a frosty 62 degrees, just to see the balance in my savings account crawl up to the price tag. I visited that shop 3 times before I finally pulled the trigger, and even had to beg off my temp shift that morning just to be there when they dropped it off. The movers arrived around 10. There were 2 guys. The taller one was fine, careful coming through the narrow doorway and asking where I wanted things set up. The other one, shorter and heavy-set with these pale, flat eyes that unsettled me the second he walked in, kept dragging his end of the table instead of lifting it properly. I watched him do it twice and held my tongue, but the third time I heard the sickening scrape, I flipped. I pointed at the jagged gouge along the left side of the tabletop and told him he gotta be careful, or I'll be making him pay for the damage. He looked at me, rolled his eyes, and kept dragging it. I stepped in his way, shouting for him to stop. He just ignored me like I was a fly. 4 months of freezing and eating cheap rice boiled over in my head, and before I knew what I was doing, I slapped him hard. The air in the room changed instantly. He turned toward me, chest puffed out, looking like he was about to flatten me. The taller guy jumped in, physically shoving him toward the door. The short guy was yelling over his shoulder that I was going to regret it, that he knew where I lived now. The tall guy mumbled a quick sorry, grabbed the dolly, and they peeled out of the lot. I double-locked the door, my hand shaking so hard I could barely turn the deadbolt. I stood by my new, damaged table, trying to convince myself it was just big talk. Guys like that are all blusters. By sunset, I'd managed to talk myself down. I had some takeout and a glass of cheap wine, watching a sitcom to drown out the silence. Around 9, the sky opened up. I did a lap of the apartment, checking the locks before I crawled into bed. Maybe an hour later, I woke up to the sound of a massive crash from the front of the house. The power flickered before it died completely. I sat frozen, staring at the sliver of light coming through my cracked bedroom door. Through the gap, I could see the frosted glass panel by the front entrance. There was a shadow there, still as a statue. I blinked to ensure it wasn't a tree branch or a trick of the light, and really the outline of a person. But it stayed. I hurriedly scrambled for my phone, but it had lost signal at some point during the storm. I got up and took the heavy candlestick from the dresser and went to the kitchen and stood with my back against the wall and listened. A few seconds later, the front door creaked open. I knew I'd locked it and used the deadbolt, but those heavy footsteps were in my hallway now. He was whispering my name. My blood ran cold. Without thinking, I bolted through the kitchen and up the back stairs. I locked myself in the bathroom, shoving the heavy wooden laundry hamper against the door and sitting on the edge of the tub, clutching the candlestick like a lifeline. He was at the door in seconds. He gave 3 polite knocks, like he was delivering a package, before the first kick came. The old door frame started to splinter with every hit, and he started shouting at me to come out. Tears started rolling down my face. I couldn't think of a way out. Suddenly, I remembered my smartwatch. My hands were slick with sweat, but I found the emergency SOS button and held it down. By the time the wood finally gave way, I was already halfway out the small bathroom window. The latch sliced into my arm, but I didn't feel the pain until I hit the wet grass 6 feet below. My left ankle buckled with a sickening pop. I somehow scrambled across the yard and found the neighbor's garden shed. It was unlocked. I slipped inside and hid behind a row of rusted metal shelves, pressing my hand over my mouth to stifle my ragged breathing. I could hear him out there. He was circling around. I could hear the sound of boots on wet gravel. At one point, he was right on the other side of the thin metal wall. I could hear his wet, heavy breathing through the siding. I squeezed my eyes, praying for him to hop off. Suddenly, the far-off wail of a siren cut through the thunder, and I heard him take off running. The cops caught him a few blocks away. They told me they found rope, heavy-duty zip ties, and a box cutter in his bag. The officer said I was lucky that I got out alive. I ended up with 8 stitches in my forearm and a sprained ankle that kept me on crutches for over a month. I still have that oak table. I put a big potted fern over the gouge he left. Some days, I think about selling it, but that feels like giving up, so it stays. I don't do deliveries anymore, though. If it won't fit in the back of a friend's truck and I can't haul it up the stairs myself, I don't need it. I've never once complained about the heavy lifting. I'd been hauling furniture for about 2 years. I started right after my folks kicked me out. It was a mind-numbing and tiring gig, but it brought food on the table and kept a roof over my head, so I didn't think about it much. Most people were either invisible or way too chatty. I'd seen 100 living rooms and figured I knew the drill. Until the delivery to Route 49 came. An old lady named Agnes had ordered a custom-made 3-legged table. The address was way out past the edge of town on a country road. Throughout the drive, my GPS kept glitching, but it had happened before on some older routes, so I kept driving. The house was 2 stories, wood construction, and seemed to have been built in the 80s. The porch steps shifted under my boots when I carried the table up. The door opened before I'd even finished knocking. The lady was small and somewhere in her 60s. Her white hair was worn loose around her shoulders, and she was wearing this faded, oversized tunic that looked like it had seen better days. She spotted the table and her face lit up. She gestured for me to haul it into the parlor. I stepped inside and immediately felt like I'd walked into the wrong century. The room was packed, wall to wall. Clusters of little voodoo dolls were pinned everywhere, mixed in with strings of small animal bones. Someone had drawn weird chalky symbols along the baseboards that didn't look like anything I recognized. Every flat surface was covered in candles. The whole place reeked of stale beeswax and damp earth. I dropped the table exactly where she pointed. She laid her hands flat on the wood, closed her eyes, and gave a slow nod, like the table was talking back to her. She told me it was a planchette table, that she was a medium, and that she used these tables to help people communicate with the dead. I should have just taken my invoice and bounced. I had 2 more stops to make and the sun was already way past noon. But Liam's face dangled in my eyes. It had been nearly a month since the crash took him. We'd been best friends since our sophomore year, and a day hadn't gone by when I hadn't missed him. So I heard myself ask her if she could reach him. She happily agreed. She asked me to light all the candles around us. She set 2 chairs at the table, placed the planchette on the surface between us, and told me to put my fingers on it lightly and not to take them off regardless of what happened. I watched her close her eyes and start whispering. At first, everything felt completely normal. I was even grimacing inside that I fell for it. Nobody could talk to the dead. But after 5 minutes, the temperature started dropping to the point where I got shivers. Every candle in that room tilted sideways at the same time, but there wasn't a lick of wind. Agnes went completely vacant. Her breathing slowed. Her hands turned white where they gripped the planchette, and her head slumped forward like somebody had cut her strings. I'd nearly got up and booked out of the room when she started giggling. My blood turned to ice. She started rambling incoherently. Before I knew it, Liam was there. He was chanting my name. The voice was unmistakably his, but the words coming out weren't. It was poisonous and angry. He started sobbing, accusing me of being a wuss for a friend. He said I'd watched him die, that I was right there on the shoulder of the road when the car flipped and didn't do anything to save him. I wasn't, though. I was dead to the world in my apartment 3 miles away. The cops verified it. I had the receipt from the diner, but hearing his voice say it crawled doubt in my own skin. Agnes's face started twitching, muscles pulling in directions that weren't meant to go. When her eyes finally snapped open, angry tears rolled down her white pupils. The voice growled and shouted as Agnes convulsed. Things started falling off the shelves. A heavy mason jar shattered against the drywall inches from my ear, showering me in glass. The tables started bucking like a live thing, rattling so hard the planchette went flying across the floor and cracked against the baseboard. All of a sudden, she stood up, drifted upright, and started coming at me. I screamed, kicked my chair over, and scrambled through the hall. I didn't stop until I was locked in the cab of my truck with the engine screaming. I drove for 20 minutes before I realized my hands were shaking too hard to stay in the lane. I had to pull over at a gas station to keep from barfing. A week later, I was scrolling through the news when her face stopped my thumb. Agnes was found dead in that same parlor. The report called it a violent struggle. Towards the end, the table was mentioned. It was found snapped clean in half. The candles had burned circles into the floorboards. I came real close to calling 911 to spill everything, but I stopped. What was I going to tell them? That some creepy table told me I was a killer? They tossed me in a psych ward before I even got to an interrogation room. But whenever I close my eyes now, I still see those eyes and feel the burn of those jars shattering. I can still hear Liam, too, calling me a shitty friend. I find myself replaying the whole night over and over. I check the clock on my stove, the time-stamped texts from that night when I was home. I know I was. But then, why's Liam's angry voice silencing my truth? My mom and Uncle Carlisle hadn't talked in forever before she rang him up in the spring of 2019. I wasn't really sure what they talked about, and honestly, I didn't ask. The fact that she was even reaching out to him meant things at home were really bad. My dad had gotten himself into some legal mess that I'm not going to dive into here, and she needed a place to stash me for the summer. With all her other siblings already on vacation, Uncle Carlisle was her only option. When he actually said yes, she was caught so off guard she kept bringing it up the whole drive to the airport while she gave me the lowdown on the guy. Ever since he was a kid, Uncle Carlisle wanted to be some big-shot scientist, but he couldn't really cut it in school. So he ended up turning his place into a DIY laboratory to keep doing his own thing. She told me he was a bit eccentric, but totally harmless. He picked me up in a truck that smelled like a mix of bleach and stale coffee. He was thinner than I pictured, with these yellowed stained fingers and glasses that sat all crooked on his nose. The second I buckled my seatbelt, he started rattling off the house rules. I had to cook for myself, do my own laundry, and handle the dishes. All of his lab gear was strictly off limits, and I wasn't allowed to have anyone over. He made sure to tell me twice not to touch anything in that lab. I didn't really know what to say, so I just kept nodding. He lived out in rural Wisconsin in a ramshackle mansion. The house was 3 stories tall, with paint peeling off and long, ugly strips. When I stepped inside, the pungent smell nearly knocked me over. The lab took up most of the first floor. It was lined wall to wall with glass jars. Organs, specimens, and a bunch of other stuff were floating in yellow fluid. Without a second's delay, he showed me my room on the 2nd floor, and I locked myself right up. My mom called twice, asking how I was doing, and I told her I needed out ASAP. She told me she was making arrangements and would come get me the moment something worked out. The big crate showed up on the 3rd day, on a rainy Saturday afternoon. 2 guys lugged it up. It was almost as big as a wardrobe and had a heavy combination lock on the latch. Uncle Carlisle was at the door before they even knocked and wouldn't even let them pass the porch. When I asked if he'd needed my help, he gave me a stink eye, grabbed one end himself, and dragged it inside alone. Once inside, he kept admiring the crate, as if he'd been waiting his whole life for whatever was in that box. He strictly told me not to touch it and disappeared down the hall. I kept staring at the crate, dying to know what was in there, but I knew better than to mess with his stuff. By dinner, I'd pretty much forgotten the whole thing. The night, I was having a Skype call with Joe, my best bud, when suddenly a loud thumping started echoing from right below my room. Figuring it could be the old pipes or something, I went to check and followed the noise. I ended up right outside the lab. I peeped through the crack. The noise was coming from the crate. I was about to creep when footsteps echoed down the hall, and I ran back to my room. On the fourth night, I woke up to a high-pitched laughter coming from downstairs. I lay there for a bit, debating whether I should go or leave it be. The crate definitely held something weird, and curiosity was killing me. So I went to the landing and peeped into the lab. Uncle Carlisle was down there, darting between his machines, touching things, muttering, circling, and laughing to himself. His eyes were bright and excited. He looked up, saw me, and told me to come down. He said I had to see it. He'd actually done it. I asked him what he meant, and he told me he'd found a way to wake the dead. My eyes widened, and heart started hammering, but I could blink. The banging started inside that crate again. In seconds, it started shaking across the concrete floor. The overhead bulbs started popping out one by one. Shelves rattled, jars fell and shattered on the floor, and a rotting smell spread. Suddenly, from the second-floor hallway right above me, I heard the wailing of children. The sound was moving back and forth like they were pacing up there. It got so loud I thought my ears gonna start bleeding. I bolted for the door at the end of the lab. Uncle Carlisle was right behind me. We ran through the hallway. I made it through, but before he could get out, the door slammed shut. I heard the bolt click into place from the inside. Uncle Carlisle was screaming my name. I started pounding on the door and twisting the knob, but it was locked. His voice went up and up, getting higher until it didn't even sound human anymore. There were chants and breaking of glass and sparks from machines. It lasted maybe 2 minutes before everything went dead quiet. I kept knocking on the no, unsure what to do. About half an hour later, a sheriff patrol stopped. They asked me why I was outside in the rain and if I was okay. I sobbed about Uncle Carlisle. The officers went inside while I waited by the driveway. One of them came back out, whispered something to his colleague, and the two headed back in. Nobody told me a thing until we were at the station. Uncle Carlisle was dead on the lab floor. Someone had ripped his eyes off his sockets and left him to bleed. The crate was still locked, and they had to cut through the latch to open it. Inside was the mummified body. It was really old and tiny, but was perfectly preserved. Uncle Carlisle had illegally bought to conduct a science experiment. The mummy was in the same state it was brought, except its eyes were now filled with a pair of fresh human eyes, as if it had been recently stitched there. The investigation lasted about 2 years, but I stopped following it because Mom asked me not to. She said I'd already seen enough, and I couldn't agree more. We eventually got back to our normal lives, but there hadn't been a night since when I hadn't relived the evening, heard his shrills for help, or heard the rumble of the crate in my sleep.